Hello, everybody. I've been asked to talk today a little bit about multidisciplinarity, education for sustainable development. And on reflection, what I thought today I'll focus on is the whole mechanics of decision making and behavioral change. Decision making in terms of instantaneous, the short term, versus behavioral change in the long term. In other sense, mindset change. As a point of departure, I will start off by using the very famous planetary boundaries concept. It raised a lot of controversy when it was released by Rockstrom and colleagues. I had some criticisms as well, but I think what it did was to bring to the attention of policymakers, in particular policymakers and in international organizations like the UN and others, of how we need to work within specified physical, geophysical boundaries. Now, the criticism that I had at that point in time was that it was so focused on the physical and the geophysical things like climate change, nitrogen levels, fresh water, ozone, and so forth and so on, and of course biodiversity. It would have, maybe it was just the first, and so that's acceptable, but what was missing, which was critical, is the social boundaries. And when I talk about social boundaries, I'm talking about issues like inequality, issues in terms of racism, systemic racism that is now coming up into a major issue across the world. Mental depression. Just to give you some numbers, I was shocked to hear when I was reading a 2015 WHO report that 25% of children between the ages of 13 and 15 in India. But now this is not just it's a global phenomenon, but I'm just using India as an example. It just struck me, and especially now working in India, had some form of mental health problem. And these were just the reported cases. So can you imagine the numbers? And these are 13 to 15. These are our future generation. This is our hope. These are the generations that we are expecting to take us on a sustainable trajectory. But how can you expect them, and this is a sizable chunk of the population, to think about issues of sustainable development when they're fighting demons and devils within themselves? We need to address this, very important. Again, anxiety, stress created by unemployment, not knowing what the job market is going to be, even from the time they enter into a university till the time they come out 3 years or 4 years later. What about those who don't go into universities? Vocational training, those who finish with high schools. These are issues that we have to really take into account. Then, of course, many say we're living at the times of peace. We have not seen a war of the kind that we saw in World War II. True. I don't deny that. But on the other hand, the trend of increasing localized and regional conflicts is just increasing significantly. The riots had increased by 282%. People are unhappy. Even if you look at a crude index of happiness index, people are not happy, and we need to change that. And that has to be an essential ingredient of sustainable development, and not just looking at the biophysical aspects. And so this comes to the decision making. And I want to do, you might consider this as a 101 on neurosciences, but this is an area that I found fascinating when I took over this position at the Mahatma Gandhi Institute. And the research that was coming out from the neurosciences of learning and also from decision making. Now, many of you most probably would have known of Kahneman's System 1, System 2 thinking. But the neurobiology behind that is also fascinating, and we need to understand how that works. Because later on, I'll talk about how we can actually train that. Right? But we need to understand the mechanics of that. And I thought I'll give you a little bit of an insight of what I thought was an interesting concept that was coined by Daniel Goleman in his 1990 book, 5 book on emotional intelligence, the thing called amygdala hijack. So what happens is that, and this is much more complicated. I'm just trying to simplify this. I would suggest that you go and have a look at his book, and then from the references, if you're really interested in the neurosciences, maybe Richard Davidson's book might be useful, or Sapolsky's book on Behave. Because they say that we are neurobiologically wired for empathy and compassion, and yet we have set up a system that brings out the worst in us. The good news is that we can train, but I'll leave that in a little bit later. Now, a little bit about the mechanics. So we read, we see, we feel. These are all our extrasensory senses. That gets processed into information that goes into our limbic system, or the thalamus. And based on what comes there and what resides in the hippocampus, which is the memory base, the limbic, which is where the emotions get triggered, starts to react to those senses. Now, the normal way, which what Kahneman would talk about system 2, is that those signals are also sent to the neocortex. That's the rational brain. Okay? And so the interplay, and I want to emphasize, it's an interplay between emotions and the rational part of the brain. And that's how the decision making is. So with the neocortex, it becomes the rational, and then through that interplay with the emotions, then it comes out and we react, and that's how the decision makes. Now, if the amygdala, which is in the limbic region, hijacks and immediately reacts before bringing the processing that comes from the neocortex, that's when we get into the fight, flight, the 3 Fs, or freeze. Or, might turn some of you to make you blush, the 4th F, which is the fornicate part, which is survival. That's how we continue with our human species. Now, these are good. We need to have that as well. But the fact is that if there is a hijack, the emotions take over. And when the emotions take over, the rationality is just thrown out of the window. And this happens a lot in times for sustainable development decisions. And peace is a critical part of the sustainable trajectory, right? So the decision to fight, that's an unsustainable trajectory. Train the emotions, we can. And then we have this whole notion of dissonance. And dissonance is when we know that we want to do something, these are our values, but on the other hand, we have other factors that kind of push us to do something which is in contrast to what we think is the moral thing to do. So you get into the Kantian world of the categorical imperative and the moral imperative, and we get into the field of philosophy. But again, that is defined by what goes on in that 3-pound mass that we carry between our ears. So the take-home message here is that we can train, and we should train, the emotional part of our brains. And studies have shown us again and again that we can do this really well. So, under the rubric of what we call socio-emotional learning is how we train the emotional brain. And that can come through many ways. But I would sort of say the 3 main components of what we would call a socio-emotional learning is first the self-regulation and the emotion regulation. Remember when I mentioned to you, how can we think about sustainable consumption, sustainable production, trying to get sustainable activities when we ourselves are in a state of anxiety, depression, and so forth and so on. We need to find peace within ourselves. We need to be comfortable. And that's the part where we call mindfulness activities, which train the emotion regulation and the self-regulation. Right? But that's not enough. We need to do the empathy training, which means we have to think about the other. Reduce the me and you, reduce us and them, but look at us as one humanity living on a very fragile planet called, as Carl Sagan calls it, the pale blue dot. So we need to, the empathy training is so important. But we can't even stop at the empathy training, because trying to empathize with the other, to understand the other, you have a distinction between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. We need both, right? We need to understand the emotions of the other. Very similar to what Rawls tried to do through his second theorem on the veil of ignorance. Right? The compassion part is important because that's the action part. To do something, you empathize with it. So collaboration is important. How to help the others. Yeah? It's not the same as charity. It's not the same as even charity, in a broad sense. It's very different. And the training that goes through that has to be very well designed and well thought through, and it also has to be dependent on age. Brain maturation is very important in that training. Now, we have done many different ways of training it. What I found a great way is through games, digital games. I used to teach economics previously, and sometimes I found it so boring that I fell asleep myself while lecturing economics. And one of the concepts that I've been working is called the Inclusive Wealth Report, that goes beyond this whole notion of gross domestic product as a way to measure the way that we are on a sustainable trajectory. So the Inclusive Wealth Report, developed by economists like Partha Dasgupta, Carl Goren, Kenneth Arrow, a little role that I played was to bring in the data for about 143 countries, and then developed a report which was first released in 2012 at the Rio Summit. It's a lot of mathematics. It puts kids to sleep really quickly. So we developed a game, and you know what? We found the students really enjoying it. They formed groups. They played games with each other. They played the interlinkages through trade, through climate change, through emissions, through the damage functions. And then what we have not done yet, and we are going to hope to do it, but we have done it in other games, is to do the empathy training. How do you empathize with another country, which is being on the receiving end? And you are, in terms, responsible for a large chunk of those emissions. How do you work in compassion that you help each other? Technology transfer, or so many different ways of exploring these options. These are all compassion activities. Yeah? Not looking at it for something in return for yourself, but for the sake of humanity living on this planet. And we developed what we call the kanthos world. You're more than happy to go online. We developed an online learning system called Framerspace. You log in, it's GDPR compliant, and you can play games, you can use for classes, and I'm more than happy that we can collaborate post this lecture. So I want to end now with sort of say 3 take-home lessons. The first one is short-term decision-making and long-term behavioral change is a result of an interplay between the rational and the emotional. It is not one or the other, it's an interplay. And it's always an interplay. It's whether they have been trained equally. We have put so much emphasis on training the cognition, the rational part, with knowledge, with what we do in universities. We don't focus at all on the emotion. And we're making a plea that we should do that. The second takeaway, that emotional can be trained, just as we train our brain on the rational part. And we have so much of studies, so much of research to support how those things are done and how to measure those as well. The third take home is that social-emotional learning must be mainstreamed within our education system, starting from kindergarten up to university or vocational. And in fact, it should be a lifelong learning experience, that it should be throughout our life that we learn social-emotional learning. And it gives you the highest return on investments. We have that data. We just released a report over 2 years that we did a study on the state of review of social-emotional learning. The returns are in the range of 7% to 10%. The impact on academic achievements is about 11 points, and yes, huge impacts across society, which we even haven't started to address and measure. So those are my take-home lessons, And so, I would urge that, if nothing, to mainstream social and look into how that can be integrated, not only in sustainable development courses, but throughout all our learning experience. Thank you very much.